The video you're about to see is a small clip from my episode 5 breakdown, which is coming out in a few days. But I didn't want to wait a few days to start talking about who the Watcher is, and so share your theories with me down in the comments down below, and let's talk about who the Watcher is, and let's see if we can nail this down once and for all before we go watch The Last Supper Part 3 in theaters this Thursday. I want to give my final speculations on who the Watcher is, because now we see that he is an associate of Nicodemus, which does shape a little bit of how we might speculate about who this guy is. One person I think that we can rule out for sure about who the Watcher is I think we can rule out that he is John Mark. And that is because in the preview for the next 3 episodes, I believe we actually did see John Mark. In that preview, we see a young boy who is ushering people in through a door, and I can almost guarantee you, like with confidence, that is going to be John Mark. We're going to see him later on. So I think we will see John Mark in the next 3 episodes, so we can rule that out. I do not think that the Watcher is him. The next up person I would guess, and this is probably the person I'm still leaning towards the most, I would say that this could be Luke, the author of the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts. And the main reason I suggest this is because of how much attention they have drawn to him writing, right? I've talked about this in the past, but to me, it seems like one thing that they're trying to do in the show is they're trying to include all 4 of the evangelists, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew and John, they're both apostles, and so we've seen them quite a bit. But one thing that they've done throughout the show is they've had them writing down quite a bit. And we don't really see a lot of people writing in the show, right? And so whenever you see people continually writing a lot, usually that's kind of them saying, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, this is one of the authors of the Gospels, right? And so Matthew and John, they're apostles. We see them a lot, and they write quite a bit throughout the show, right? We're going to see Mark in the next 3 episodes. And so the only other person we need to see is Luke. Technically, Luke did show up in the Christmas special, The Messengers, but that was a much older version of Luke, and so he could be played by a different actor. And the fact that they have him writing so much right here, to me, would seem to suggest that it could be Luke himself. He's always going around. He's documenting events. We do know that Luke was a historian as well as a physician, right? And so this was a guy who, in his gospel itself and also in the Book of Acts, he talks about how he is a person who has gathered eyewitness testimonies, right? And he has listen to other people's accounts. And so he is somebody who does document things as a historian. And we also know that Luke was a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. And so him having a connection to a prominent religious leader like Nicodemus could explain how he also makes a connection with the Apostle Paul as well, right? Because Paul at this time period would be an up-and-coming star who's just rising through the ranks of Judaism, right? And so to me, I think there's good evidence that this is probably going to be Luke, mainly because of how much they have him writing, right? That is to me a big selling point, because if this is, I'm going to list some other options here. If it's any of the other options, to me, it's very weird why they've had him writing so much, unless they were just trying to trick us, which is possible. And I will admit that this is probably the most intrigued I've been by the identity of a character in the show. So what they're doing with him is interesting, because I've been very entertained by it. The few things that I would say that are against this being Luke is, first off, historically speaking, we have very little reason to believe that Luke ever encountered Jesus during his ministry. But to be fair, counterpoint, we haven't seen this guy directly interact with Jesus during the show, right? And a lot of the events he's been writing down aren't actually like the events that he has been an eyewitness to in the show. Most of them are not events that actually show up in Luke's gospel, right? There's a few that have, like he was there for the triumphal entry and stuff. But a lot of the events are things that don't show up in his gospel. And so it could be that he's saying, hey, I was not an eyewitness to this stuff in my gospel, even though I did see other stuff, right? And so you can see how they can work around it, but we have very little reason to believe that Luke was an eyewitness to these things. And actually, it would seem to suggest that Luke actually didn't even really show up into Paul's ministry until I think it's around like Acts chapter 16 or something like that. And so if it is Luke, they're kind of messing around with the history a little bit there. Is it plausible? Sure. But I'm still leaning it primarily towards it being Luke. Another thing that might be against that is I can't tell if this guy is Jewish or Gentile. There's some things that he does that seem more Gentile in nature, but it could be that he's just more of a Hellenistic Jew. Or it could be that we're just reading too much into it and that he's just outright Jewish, because since he is acquainted with Nicodemus, it would seem like he probably is Jewish. I don't know. But so it's not Mark. It could be Luke. Another person that I would suggest is plausible, and I hadn't thought about this before, but it could be Barnabas, right? And the main reason I'm saying this is that Dallas has confirmed that this person is a character from Scripture, right? And so we know this person is from Scripture. It's just a matter of who is it going to be. And so I could say it could be Barnabas, because we know that Barnabas was somebody who was very active in the church early on, right? He shows up in Acts chapter 4, which is during the formative months of the church, which only takes place a few months after the events we're dealing with here. And he does seem to be an active member of the church in Jerusalem, right? Well, that could explain that. Another thing that we know about Barnabas is that he was from a foreign place, and so that could explain some of his Gentile influence. And we know that he also had some money to him, right? Because the way that we're introduced to Barnabas in Acts chapter 4 is that basically he sells a bunch of, like, he sells some of his land, and he uses that money to give it to the church. And so if we're looking at this character, you've got a Jewish guy who has some Gentile influence, and he seems to be of certain, like he has some means, and he has some connections with people in Jerusalem. Well, that would line up with Barnabas, and it also could, pave the way for, the Book of Acts series or something that they're wanting to do later on. And so I think that Barnabas isn't out of the realms of possibility. I think that actually is worth considering, to where, I don't know, the actor is young enough to where if they were wanting to do a Book of Acts series later on, you could easily have this guy just play Barnabas and just go on into it. I think that'd be kind of cool, and it'd be wise to introduce him now so that the apostles become more familiar with him, so that whenever Barnabas shows up in the Book of Acts, you're like, oh, okay, we know who this guy is, right? And so I could see that being plausible as well, but that is kind of just me speculating. Another person is Cleopus, and this is a person who shows up in the Gospel of Luke. He is the named disciple who Jesus encounters on the road to Emmaus. And honestly, I don't really have much behind this other than the fact that if we're getting to the resurrection in season 7, you got to realize that while we are several seasons away from that, ultimately that is only if this is Wednesday, that is 4 days away, right? So Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, right? So the 4th day, it's going to be Sunday. And so while the road to Emmaus thing, if they're going to depict that in the show, while that, honestly, given how the show works, I wouldn't be surprised if they devote an entire episode to the road to Emmaus. I just wouldn't be surprised by it. But if they're going to depict that, they probably want it to be with somebody that we have met. And it makes more sense to introduce this person before Jesus dies, so that he could be talking about the fact that Jesus did die, which would give context to the road to Emmaus thing. And so that's really my whole thing behind that. I'm just more thinking from a writer's perspective. If they're thinking, hey, we want to do this storyline in episode 7, and we want to follow a character that we've been with before, and we know that one of them is a guy named Cleopus, okay, well, let's introduce him in season 5, right? And so I could see this possibly being him as well. And then you could see him and some disciple, maybe even Nicodemus, I have no idea, because the other disciple is not named in that story. They could be on the road to Emmaus, they encounter Jesus, and they have this whole conversation. It could be really cool. And so that's another guess. And then just another shot in the dark I'm going to take. I don't think they're going to do this, but I could see it being compelling from a writing perspective. I think this could be the rich young ruler, right? And I'll explain why I think that. The main reason I think they're not going to do this is because, like I said, it seems like the next 3 episodes are going to have to take place over the course of a 24-hour time period, because this episode ends on Wednesday night. And they could just mess around with the chronology a little bit. They do that a lot in the show. But presumably the next 3 episodes are all going to take place on starting Wednesday night all the way to Thursday night, right? To where I imagine the season's probably going to end with Jesus either getting arrested or being betrayed or something like that. And I don't know if there's going to be really any room to do the rich young ruler thing, unless they just have it happen really quick. I don't know. And you know what? They could make him be the rich young ruler who eventually becomes Barnabas. I have no idea, because the rich young ruler is not named in Scripture. But one reason why this to me becomes more compelling is because he is associated with Nicodemus, right? Because if you know the story of the rich young ruler in Scripture, basically he's this young dude who's wealthy. He comes to Jesus. He says, "What must I do to be saved?" Jesus says, "Sell all you have, give it to the poor, and then, follow me." And then the guy leaves, and he leaves weeping. And to me, the reason why that would be compelling is because that very nearly parallels the story we had with Nicodemus back in season 1. And so what better place to do that story again than through this guy who's associated with Nicodemus, right? It'd be kind of poetic, right? To where you have Nicodemus in season 1, who is now going to be stepping into his faith. And then you have maybe this guy, the Watcher, who is also a wealthy young man who's associated with Nicodemus, who's heard a lot about Jesus. He comes to Jesus and says, "What must I do to be saved?" But then he also leaves, right? And so to me, that would be very compelling because basically this guy would, he would parallel the story of Nicodemus. And then if they wanted to do a big plot twist, like I said, they could make it to where this guy does end up being Barnabas, right? Because maybe he's discouraged, he doesn't want to sell his stuff, and he leaves. But then later on, after Jesus' resurrection, he becomes a Christian, right? And after he becomes a Christian, what does he decide to do? He decides to sell his land and give it to the church, right? He gives it to the poor, right? That'd be great. I would love that if they did that to where it can actually be two of these people. It could be the rich young ruler whose name happens to be Joseph Barnabas. That would be really neat. I think that'd be really cool. Writers, if you want some advice on writing, come to me. I'm just kidding. But that would be a really cool thing for them to do. And so, yeah, I just think that would be kind of fun. But I would love to hear y'all's opinions on who y'all think the Watcher is. If y'all think any of my theories are correct, just let me know. But if not, that's okay too.